Well, hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Building Accessible Events and Programs. My name is Clover Morell. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the program associate at the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation. While I normally work out of the Chicago office, today I am at home in Evanston, and that is on the unceded lands of the Kickapoo people. I am a white woman with dark brown hair, brown eyes, and light blue clear glasses, sitting in front of a blue wall in front of a blue painting for those who are in need of a visual description. I want to take a moment to thank Kathy Raycan, who is providing us with live captioning. You may turn on your captioning by looking at the bottom bar on the Zoom window and choosing live transcript. There's a little arrow there that will allow you to show the subtitle or view the full transcript. This webinar will be recorded and we will post it on YouTube with captions in a week or two, and you can share it with anybody that you'd like. So thank you so much for being here. And I'd like to turn it over to Christena Gunther, an accessibility consultant that we've been working with. She is the founder and president of the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium and has an amazing amount of information to offer. So very pleased to have you here today, Christena. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Clover, and thanks to the Donnelly Foundation for making these sessions possible. It's so nice to meet you all and see you all. It's still in our virtual land. Today, I'm going to be talking about building accessible events and programs. My name again is Christena Gunther, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am sitting in my office, which has a white wall with a window and a plant in the background. And I am a white woman in my late 30s with kind of dark glasses on and dark hair that's down. Today, we're going to be focusing a lot on how we can work within our organizations to make change happen. And I feel like that's a topic that is covered a lot right now for cultural organizations. How do we make change happen? Hopefully today I can give you some practical advice about how we can incrementally make our spaces and our events more accessible for people. So, and then also, because this inevitably comes up as a question, I will definitely be sharing lots of resources with Clover to disseminate to you. So this PowerPoint, as well as the other resources that I mentioned, will be shared. So don't worry, don't take too many notes. You can just pay attention if you can, and we'll get started. So, while I'm here in a capacity as a consultant, I did want to give a plug for CCAC, which is Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. We are a volunteer-run nonprofit, and our mission is to empower Chicago's cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities. And we do this primarily in three ways. One, by providing professional development workshops, kind of like this, or perhaps on a more specific topic. Free accessible equipment loans. Our loan program is starting up again now that in-person events are happening again. So that's another awesome opportunity for you to get connected with free equipment. And then an access calendar that lists accessible offerings happening in the Chicago region. I would love for you to join our listserv to learn more about future professional development workshops. You can feel free to email me. My email address was on this beginning slide, but it's cgunther@chicagoculturalaccess.org, and we'll be sharing that again as well. I should also mention, I forgot to mention at the top, but I'm sharing a PowerPoint while I'm talking, and this PowerPoint primarily is going to be text, and it is has like a template, which is a white wall and a wood floor that kind of mimics, I think, a gallery experience, which is why I chose this template. So it's always helpful to describe to everyone what's being shared. It's helpful for people who have low vision or who are blind. It's also helpful if you have anybody who's joining by phone as well. So just a little tip that I'm trying to model myself. how did I get started with this work is often a question I receive. And I have been sharing, if you've come to our other sessions or watched the other recordings, I've been sharing different pictures of my brother, Travis. My brother's younger than me. He has Down syndrome, and it's just the two of us in our family with our mom and dad. And so my whole life has been spent really considering and talking about accessibility and disability in different ways. And so I'm sharing on the left a photo of Travis. He is a white man in his 30s sitting in a wheelchair. He's got a bit of a belly and he's waving with his hand and holding my purse that's full of stuff, but he's sitting in a wheelchair and being pushed by somebody else, by my boyfriend. But I wanted to share the picture on the left because this is a photo from us going to the Ringling Museum in Sarasota, Florida. And Travis, because he has hypotonia, has difficulty sometimes walking or standing for long periods of time. So typically when we go to a museum, we usually borrow a courtesy wheelchair. So I wanted to share the picture of Travis in the courtesy wheelchair as we're experiencing a museum together. And in the background is my mom, who's walking, and we're outside. And then on the right, I just put a picture of Travis and me together, and we are at the Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. And we're seated together, kind of embracing each other, smiling, and we're sitting on a Dali-inspired bench. So I wanted to share two photos of Travis and me experiencing museums together, which is something that my entire family loves to do together and is what's really spurred me on in this work too. So the plan for today is I wanted to establish some definitions and make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about disability. Some of this may be a refresher if you've joined me for the past sessions. If you're new, hopefully this will give you a good framework as we get started. And then we'll talk a lot about getting started, or if you've already begun your accessibility work, how to move that forward. So how to keep constantly moving to become a more accessible place. A lot of questions came up in the survey that I had sent out about funding, which makes sense. So we'll talk a bit about funding. And then I have included some of your submitted questions that you shared. And then if there's time, I would love to hear more questions from you too. So please use the Q&A and we will cover those questions at the end as well. But I want to make sure we are addressing a lot of the things that you brought up in the survey too. So what is disability? This could be a session in and of itself. It's quite complicated, but I wanted to share a few different definitions for you that hopefully help establish for you what disability means and what how to think about it in your own organization. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990 and is civil rights legislation, a civil rights law that protects people with disabilities, defines disability as someone who has a record of or is regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So that could be eating, breathing, walking, talking, seeing, etc. So it's a huge, huge category that impacts people in many different ways. I want to share a few other definitions with you, and some of these definitions may be new if you came to the past sessions too. I found another great definition that I love from the Nora Project, which is a great organization to check out. The Nora Project defines disability as a difference in the way a person moves, communicates, feels, and/or processes information. It's a difference in the way they complete the tasks of daily life. There's nothing good or bad about disability. It's a form of human diversity. I really love this definition because it kind of simplifies the ADA definition, but it's also being very clear that it's a neutral term. It's neither a positive nor a negative. It just is a fact. So I think that's helpful for us as we think about disability and especially how to welcome our guests who have disabilities. Remembering that disability is a normal part of the human experience. Another way to think about disability that I've shared before is from the World Health Organization. which defines disability as a contextual variable, dynamic over time and in relation to circumstances. One is more or less disabled based on the interaction between the person and the individual, the institutional, and social environments. And this idea was inspired by the social model of disability. I talked a lot about the social model of disability in my first session that I did for the Donnelly Foundation. So check out that recording if you want to find out more about what that is. But what's really helpful here is to think about how institutions, how power structures really are determining who has a disability and who isn't, because it's ultimately about design, whether that's the design, the physical design or architectural design of a space, or if it's about how we're designing a program or how we're communicating for people. So if we are able to make changes for that, then people actually really don't have a disability. So for instance, if we think about an example I usually share is a friend of mine who uses a wheelchair. And if that friend has an apartment, for instance, that is accessible by an elevator, and that apartment is designed specifically for somebody in a wheelchair. So it's really easy for them to get into the shower, really easy for them to use the toilet, easy for them to use the kitchen and access all the cabinets, basically go about their business and be able to reach and take care of everything that they need to take care of, go about their activities of daily living because it's been designed for them, then in fact, they really don't have a disability. There's really no issue there at all. It's when we try to put people that are different or seem different into a space that's not been designed for them that we really see a lot of issues. So thinking about, for instance, if we are thinking about the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has beautiful big stairs that lead to the entrance, those stairs are beautiful and quintessential to the museum. And when you think about the museum, maybe you think about people sitting on the steps and having their lunch. But it was a choice, it was a decision for the museum to add those stairs. And if they had designed an entrance that just was at street level, that had no stairs, it would be a lot easier for many other people to come in. So thinking about the choices that we make as institutions that have implications for people with disabilities and for many other users as well. So some fast facts about disability, some things to keep in mind. Sometimes people have preconceived ideas or prejudices or, just some ignorance about what disability is and really what a huge category it is. So remember that nearly 1 in 4 Americans has some type of disability. It's a huge amount of people, 25%. This percentage is expected to grow as we age and live longer. African Americans are more likely than non-Hispanic whites to have a disability in every age group. So being aware of the intersectionality, being aware that disability does come into play with race, with gender, with many other things as well. So realizing that it really is when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organizations, disability is a part of that diversity, but it also has implications for these other marginalized groups as well. Something else to think about and keep in mind is that anyone may join the disability community at any time, temporarily or permanently. I myself now have a disability. When I started this work, I did not have a disability. I live with post-concussion syndrome, and maybe it will get better, maybe it won't. I'm not sure. So this is an example of somebody who's joined the disability community, maybe temporarily or maybe permanently, but any one of us could be a part of that community, whether it's through an accident or through aging or through many other factors that may happen. Remembering that many disabilities are invisible. If you were to meet me on the street, I don't know if you would know that I have a disability. So I need to identify if I need to get some accommodations or resources. Otherwise, you might not know that I have a disability. So remembering by looking at somebody, that's not giving us much information about whether or not they have a disability. Remembering also that people may have multiple disabilities. So while we're talking sometimes about different categories of disability, remembering that you could have an assortment of different related disabilities. And this is especially true as we see people aging. So I think we all know, maybe in ourselves or for grandparents or parents or other loved ones as they age, to see that their hearing isn't as good as it used to be. So we're seeing some hearing loss. We're seeing vision-related disabilities, maybe macular degeneration. Maybe they're having a hard time moving around and going upstairs, so maybe they have a walker or a rollator. I think we all expect this as a part of aging, but we don't often think about it as a disability. So that can be helpful in our thinking too. And then finally, remembering that all disabilities exist on a spectrum, so that, you know, somebody is not like completely blind or completely sighted. There is a lot in between. Just even people with Down syndrome, like my brother, there's a spectrum of what that looks like and what that means. So while we might generalize some things about different groups to try to make it easier, and there are some things that it might be true for a lot of people, remembering that if you've met one person with a disability, then you've met one person with a disability. So keep that in mind as well. What might work for one person might not work for another. So we need to also be prepared to be flexible and to really allow for the individual guests to tell us what they need. It might not be something that we've thought of before. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all situation. And then finally, in terms of important definitions to establish, is ableism. And this is something that I've not previously included in presentations, and I'm not sure why, but I've been doing a lot of work and thinking a lot about racism and different isms and making sure that we talk about ableism, because nearly all of our institutions are probably ableist in some way. So ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. This is a quote from Talila Lewis and Dustin Gibson. So I really challenge you as well, when we think about how to make our organizations more accessible, to also look at the root cause of a lot of these issues, which is what values and ideas about what is normal do you hold that may unconsciously perpetuate ableist attitudes? How are we in our institutions upholding ableism, and how can we change that? That's a bigger topic and something to think about and reflect on your own. But please do start thinking about that if you haven't already. And I know based on the survey, many of you are already thinking about this too. So one of the examples and ways I think that ableism can pop up is that there's kind of an assumption that because we think disabilities are all visible, that we're going to be able to know who has a disability, that somehow we'll know when we're interacting with somebody. So for instance, when I've done trainings for tour guides at museums, tour guides that lead tours for field trips, for instance, they talk about, what if we get a special ed class that, how do we give a tour for them? And that's a great question to ask and something we can talk more about. But I also challenge them to realize that probably for every tour, there's going to be multiple people with disabilities that are on the tour, and they might not identify. I might not know in advance. Maybe I'll figure it out as we go along. Maybe I won't. But realizing that there are people with disabilities that we're encountering constantly. So I shared this slide, which says museum and theater staff, and remembering that museum staff and theater staff may have disabilities too, that they will likely encounter disabled people at every event, performance, or tour each day. So keeping in mind that statistic of 1 in 4 Americans having some type of disability, when you actually apply it to a lot of these situations, you realize there's actually quite a few people with disabilities that we're interacting with all of the time. Whether or not they identify as having a disability, whether or not they need any accommodations, all of that, that's a different topic. But realizing that we actually are interacting with people with disabilities all of the time is kind of can blow your mind for a minute if you haven't thought about it that way. So I encourage you to keep that in mind and be challenging people that are saying, you know, we don't have disabled people that come to our spaces. Sometimes I hear, especially directors or leadership of an organization saying, well, we don't have many people that need this. Actually, you might, but you don't know because you're not doing anything for them and you're not asking and you're not finding out any information. So chances are good that you're going to have a person with a disability in every situation that you might have at your organization. And then I also realized as I've been preparing for this presentation that I use the word accommodations a lot, and I don't know if I've ever defined it before. And accommodations is really the shorthand way that we reference reasonable modifications, and reasonable modifications come straight to us from the ADA itself. Another word instead of accommodations you could use would be access services. But I did want to share where that the term modifications and policies, practices and procedures comes from in the ADA, if it's helpful for you. And I linked to it in this PowerPoint that you'll receive, so you can follow the link as well. But basically, a public accommodation, so like your theater, museum, your space, a public accommodation shall make reasonable modifications in policies, practices, or procedures when the modifications are necessary to afford goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations to individuals with disabilities. So we use the shorthand accommodations to mean that we're going to modify something. We're going to offer something else for make a change so that a person with a disability is able to participate or able to access the information or the space that we're talking about. So that is accommodation. So where should we begin? How do we get started doing this work? We've talked a bit about it in previous sessions, but I think it's helpful to try to break it down a bit. Sometimes it can be helpful to think about different categories of accessibility. So like I said, sometimes we generalize different groups of people with disabilities might need different things. So trying to break that down a little bit in order for you to help prioritize where you should get started. Physical accessibility, I think that's what comes to mind for most people when we're talking about access. But physical accessibility is thinking about accessible restrooms, seats, entrance, parking, dining situation, gift shop, seating, and having wheelchairs available. All of that good stuff is all encompassed within physical accessibility and much more. Thinking about accessibility to audio or spoken content. So thinking about people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but this could also apply for people, for instance, who have auditory processing disorder, or even potentially ADHD, or have a difficulty kind of accessing spoken information. We would have captioning like we have today, or perhaps American Sign Language interpretation, assistive listening devices, or we might even have, for instance, if we were in a museum setting, might have a deaf tour guide, somebody who identifies as capital D, deaf, leading a tour in American Sign Language, for example. We've talked more specifically about all of this in previous sessions, so you can watch those videos if you want to find out more. Accessibility to visual content, so thinking about the visual things we have on stage, or the paintings on the walls, or whatever our institution is all about, how we're visually presenting things to people. We want to make sure that that content is accessible to people with different types of disabilities. So that could be people who are blind or have low vision, and it could be other people in other situations as well. So thinking about audio description and touch tours, or visual description. So audio description is usually in a performance setting, and visual description would be what we would do in a museum setting or exhibition type setting. Thinking about having our website be accessible for screen readers, and thinking about our playbill or program, for instance, we want to make sure that printed material will be available in alternate formats. So perhaps that means Braille, or maybe that means large print, or maybe that means having electronic versions of things so that people's screen readers can read it to them in advance of attending our events. Another category to think about is sensory friendly or autism friendly. So thinking of alternatives to busy or loud experiences might be noise canceling headphones, fidgets, social narratives or social story apps, sensory kits, and having performances that are sensory friendly or relaxed in nature. So those are some of the main categories of accessibility that I would say cultural organizations usually think about and provide first. The next category is sort of the next level. So organizations that have really successfully done all of those pieces then can move on to think about other disability groups and other categories of accessibility. So specifically thinking about accessibility for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, that could be having a plain language summary. So that would be kind of simplifying sort of complicated text to be more accessible for people that might have an intellectual disability, thinking especially about staff training, having specialized programs for this audience, and preparing general audience program leaders for how to adapt content in the moment if it's needed. The next category would be accessibility for people with memory loss or seniors. Or older adults. So again, maybe a plain language summary, staff training, or having specialized program might be a way that we would especially work with that audience to try to make them more accessible. And then thinking about people with mental health related conditions. So we might include a quiet space in an exhibition or even in a performance, having content warnings or having specialized programs maybe for veterans or maybe for people coming from different group home situations. So thinking about that category as well. So the three that I just mentioned, those are typically done by institutions that have already mastered that previous list that I shared. So those are other things to think about. I shared this at my first session, but I wanted to share this again. And the reason why I'm going into this detail right now is it's really helpful for you to think about the different categories of accessibility when we talk about prioritizing. So we need to create priorities and we need to know what's most important. And something that I gathered from reading some of your survey responses is that everybody knows they need to be more accessible and they're really eager to do everything as much as they can. And that's fantastic, but unfortunately isn't realistic when we know that nonprofits struggle with resources and you're probably wearing too many hats as it is. You're probably doing too many different jobs already. So we want to make sure that we're also being realistic with the priorities we're creating. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think, is something that many of us have studied maybe in your high school psychology class like I did, but let's revisit it briefly to talk about what that looks like. So I'm sharing right now an image of a triangle and at the bottom of the triangle or pyramid, there's a green section that says physiological. So in order for people to kind of go about their lives, there's different levels, different priorities of things that we need in order to really be the best us we can be. And the basis, the most pivotal thing that we need is we need to be able to have air, fresh air to breathe. We need to have food, water, and health. So we need to have that met before we can worry or focus on the next things that are listed on this pyramid. So next we see safety, the need for safety, shelter, stability. We need to feel safe in order for us to kind of move on to these next pieces. Then there is social. So the need for love, belonging, and inclusion. We need to feel that we're part of a community. And once we feel that, then we're able to focus on ego or self. So the need for self-esteem, for power, control, and recognition. And then finally, at the top of the triangle is self-actualization, the need for development, creativity, and growth. So I just created a cultural accessibility version of this to help us think about sort of where to prioritize. And it's going to be different for different institutions depending upon what your focus is. But looking at that bottom of the pyramid, the most crucial thing we need in order to get the other pieces of the pyramid is we need physiological access. So thinking about physical accessibility, the ability to enter a space, the bathroom, use the restaurant, get around in the space is very important if you have a physical plant. If you don't, then that might be the virtual setting. So that might be your virtual platform that you're using needs to be accessible to people. The next level would be safety. So this often is about staff training. So staff training to create a space free of violence and discrimination. And emergency planning and communication. So making sure that whatever we're doing to think about emergencies or think about how we're communicating to our staff and how that then is communicated to guests, we want to make sure that it's free of discrimination and violence. I think violence is kind of an intense word to use here, but I'm intentionally using it because there have been examples of people with disabilities in sort of cultural spaces where there might be something that happens. For instance, there's a man with Down syndrome who was killed at a movie theater because there was an interaction with staff gone wrong. So a misunderstanding that really escalated unnecessarily. So this is something to talk about how do we handle different situations, and especially how do we think about people with disabilities in that situation. CCAC does have a past session that we've done on emergency planning, and I believe there's one in the works this year as well to do another program on emergency planning for people with disabilities. So that's something else to think about, but want to make sure we're creating a true safe space. And then next would be social. So creating a welcoming environment. We want you to be here. And that often includes effective communication, which is a term from the ADA, but that's really making sure that the way that we're communicating, whether that's verbally or whether that's through the written word or through other means, that there is another way for somebody to access it. So if we're doing something verbally, we want to make sure we have the captioning on, or we have a transcript available. We have another way for people to access that information, and same with visual information as well. If we have visual information, we want to make sure that we're perhaps saying it as well as showing it, or having the ability for people to request audio description or different things like that. So thinking about really creating this welcoming space so that people can participate and engage like we want them to. Next level is the ego. So thinking about power, autonomy. So this is where cultural organizations get more sophisticated in terms of their accessibility. So this is especially where they're providing lots of different choices for people with disabilities so that they can choose what works best for them, and guests really can maintain their independence. So that's baked into the way that the organization operates. And then at the pinnacle, at the top of the pyramid, would be the self-actualization piece. So that is direct access to the art form, and accommodations are of very high quality. Remembering that the access services or accommodations that we provide, they're really the vehicle to communicate what our organization does. So we want to make sure that they're as good as possible. And often that means a lot of advanced prep work and a lot of time and sometimes money being put into it. So to get that high quality takes some time and takes some trial and error as well. And we also want to make sure that there is a lot of participation and planning and behind the scenes and on stage or in the exhibition of people with different disabilities as well. That's sort of the top. So I wanted to share this again to help us reframe our priorities as we go forward. This is the cheesy quote I always share, but remember this too. Accessibility is a journey and not a destination. We're never going to be done with this work. So that's job stability, I guess. But please remember that as we're constantly striving to be more accessible, it's something we're going to be doing for the entirety of our organization, and that's a good thing. So accessibility is not a box you can tick. You can't just say, but I'm ADA accessible now. That's not the way that it works. And so changing that way of thinking is going to be critical for you to move forward. So getting started or moving forward, I'll go into these in great detail, but this is a helpful list to get started. So I would encourage you to establish priorities by completing a self-evaluation. And that self-evaluation can help you track your future priorities. There's probably a lot of things that you need to do. And based upon the survey results I saw, there's a lot of things people need or want to do, which is great. There's a lot before you, but I would challenge you to write them all down and prioritize them and choose 1 to 2 things that you can work on in the next year. It's not realistic to think that you can do all of those things at once and do them well. So focusing on 1 or 2 and then growing. Determine an access point person. Spoiler, it's probably you if you're here, but make sure that there is somebody at your organization who's going to be the main person to be tracking all of this accessibility work. It's never going to work if different people are doing all these different things and there isn't one person helping to coordinate efforts. We want to make sure that you're including a statement of welcome for all events and programs. We'll talk about that in a second. Want to make sure that you're describing what your accessibility services are for your guests. Do your guests even know what you're doing? Are you telling them? Make sure that you are, because otherwise it's for nothing. Also establishing regular training for staff and volunteers. Staff training is a big piece that I feel like I say a lot, but it's true. We need to make sure our staff, volunteers, anyone who's representing our organization knows what they're talking about when it comes to accessibility. We want to find internal and external allies. Doing this work alone is not sustaining. It's not going to work if you are just the only person in your organization that wants to do this and you are not talking to anyone else. This work is best done when you're able to talk with other people. Even if you don't have anyone in your organization, then find some people outside of your organization to help motivate you and to help share resources with you and move forward. And then wherever you can, model accessibility for your colleagues. You're going to be talking about accessibility a lot if you're not already in your organization, but we want to make sure you're practicing what you preach. That, for instance, doing the visual descriptions like we've just done today for this session is a small but important step to show that you're considering other people who are coming to this meeting or to this event, that they might not be able to see you. And so that can kind of help shift people's perceptions and ways of thinking too. And enabling captions in your Zoom meetings, even if there's no one that needs it or no one that's said that they need it. Maybe there is somebody that needs it. So just trying to incorporate accessibility where you can in the workplace is another way that you can help propel your organization forward. So thinking about this self-evaluation, I will share this after the session today, but this is available on CCAC's website. There are also other self-evaluations out there as well. This one is specifically thinking about cultural spaces, so it might be helpful for you. So completing that organization self-evaluation is really important to create your priority list of things you need to work on. And it is totally okay when you're completing the self-evaluation that there may be many sections that you're not doing right now, and you're all coming from small organizations. That's okay. So don't already start by being down on yourself or down on your organization for not doing many things. The evaluation is meant to really show you all of these different categories of accessibility, that it isn't just one thing. So if you feel a little overwhelmed after you complete it, then you're doing it right. There is a lot. So keep that in mind. Make sure that you complete the self-evaluation with somebody else in your organization. Find someone else to do it with you, because sometimes this information can get really siloed. And if you ever leave your organization we wouldn't want to lose all of this institutional knowledge. So making sure somebody else knows about a little bit about what you're doing and knows a little bit about the organization is helpful. And again, it's also just helpful to be talking with somebody else as you're going through this, because again, it feels like a lot, and it is a lot for one person to do. So share this with somebody else. And even if it's a volunteer, if you're a very tiny organization, do it with somebody else. And I would encourage you to add the areas you're not currently offering, add the things where you've answered, no, we don't do that yet. In the self-evaluation, add that all to a spreadsheet and try to categorize things that seem like low-hanging fruit, seem like things that this could be doable for us to do near term in the next 1 to 2 years. And then look at the stuff that's longer term. So maybe this would be achieved in the next 2 to 6 years. This is something that you want to do, but maybe won't be easy to do right away. This document is going to be very helpful for you in order to keep moving things forward. It also can be really helpful in case of any legal action. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal expert, but I have heard a lot about different complaints and lawsuits related to the ADA. And it's always helpful, and it always reflects well on the organization if you're aware of where your shortcomings are and you're acknowledging it by making a plan going forward. So even if that plan is as simple as kind of categorizing these different things of like, this is something we know we need to do, and we're hoping we can do this in 5 years. That at least I think will show good faith that that's something that you're truly working on and you're aware of it. You also should be updating this document regularly. So maybe popping a reminder on your calendar every 6 months to just take a look at it with that colleague again. Just look at it and see how things are going. And if you find that you're really struggling with even doing the near-term things, then that means it's time to talk to somebody else at a different organization. Even if it's just to complain and say, I don't know how to do this. Do you have any ideas? That at least is going to help you be thinking and help you keep this in mind and not avoid this important work that needs to be done. Because sometimes it feels like so much that you end up kind of avoiding it or pushing it to the side because you don't know where to get started. That to me is the signal that you need to talk to somebody else to get a different perspective of how to think about this. And a big reminder as well about CCAC's accessible equipment loan. So if you're in the Chicago region, this is an awesome opportunity for you to get equipment. So that way you don't need to worry about budgeting for equipment or how do you use it, all of these different pieces. CCAC will help teach you how to use the equipment and can loan it out. And this would be for 1 or 2 performances or for an event. We can't give it to you for longer term than that, but it would be for a program or event that you're offering. But it's a helpful way to get started. And many organizations in the region have gotten started with CCAC's equipment loan, and then they understood how to use the equipment. They developed an audience, and then they purchased their own equipment a couple of years later. So that can be a helpful kind of bridge for you to get your own equipment eventually as well. So in terms of shaping your priorities from that self-evaluation, I encourage you to consider the hierarchy of cultural accessibility. So thinking about sort of what is most important. It all is important, of course, but do you have guests that have specifically asked for X, Y, or Z? You've had people request this, or you know a patron coming uses a wheelchair, or you know a patron coming uses American Sign Language. Then this can be really helpful information for you to create your priorities. There was a question in the chat about if CCAC is loaning equipment again. The plan was for us to start up again in the fall. I know that's still in the works, and I believe it should be announced very soon that the equipment loan is on again, but I can specifically get back to you who asked to make sure that I follow up with you to let you know. In terms of determining priorities, if your work exists primarily in a physical space, probably physical accessibility is a good starting point, because many other disabilities, like I said, multiple disabilities exist. Many people have multiple things going on. So if you have a lot of seniors that are coming to your space, which sometimes is true for arts organizations, a lot of our membership base is older adults. So physical accessibility is going to be pretty important to have in place for folks. But if you are renting your space or you don't have control over your physical plant, then maybe starting at a different point makes sense for you. If your work exists virtually, beginning with web or virtual event accessibility would be a smart starting point. Consider what access services may reach the most people. So if you know that somebody coming to your events always needs their program in Braille, then offering Braille for all of your events would make sense as a good starting point. However, we do know that many people who are blind or have low vision do not actually use Braille anymore. So it's a very small percentage of folks that are using Braille. So if you have to choose, I would probably say having large print and having electronic versions of printed material would be perfectly fine. And you can aim to have Braille in the future or have Braille by request if somebody requests it. Thinking about captioning versus American Sign Language, both can be really helpful for different people. And if you have not had requests for American Sign Language before, starting with captioning might be smart because many more people are going to be able to access the captioning versus a smaller percentage of people who use American Sign Language or ASL. So also just thinking about numbers, thinking about like, how are we going to reach more folks, and thinking about how to start or prioritize from there can be good. And if you're not sure how to think about these access services to know, then ask and somebody will be happy to tell you. I would be happy to share, or many other folks would be too. And then the other reminder is with all of this work that we're doing, we also need to be planning and need to be working hard, staying on course, but we need to be prepared to be flexible if a request is made. So if somebody asks for something that you're not doing, you should really focus on the request that you have, and make sure that you're meeting it, even if it's not perfectly in line with that pyramid or where your priorities are. You still need to try to honor that request, and maybe you can adjust your priorities based upon the requests you start getting. Determining an access point person is really, really helpful for this work. So if you receive any federal funding, including from the Illinois Arts Council, and that money from the Illinois Arts Council is actually from the NEA, but if you're getting, so therefore you're getting money from the NEA or the National Endowment for the Humanities, you must appoint an ADA 504 coordinator. It's actually a law. You have to do that, and many organizations don't do that. I would suggest calling the position an access coordinator position. It's okay if it's not on somebody's business card, or, you know, likely the person who's doing this role at your tiny organization is going to be you or somebody else who has another title, like, you know, I don't know, director of artistic experience. And you're also going to be the accessibility coordinator for the purposes of this grant, and also as the point person for juggling and prioritizing your accessibility work. While it is super important to have one person who's coordinating your accessibility efforts, I do want to acknowledge that accessibility is everyone's responsibility. I've heard of an organization, I wish I remember which organization it was, that put accessibility in every single job description for the organization, because it really is everyone's responsibility to be thinking about how to be more accessible for people with disabilities. But if everybody's working on these things separately, there still needs to be a person that is coordinating it, and that really knows kind of where to go for this, or this. It doesn't mean that you are the expert. It doesn't mean you know everything. I don't know everything when it comes to accessibility. There's so many questions I have myself. That's totally normal. But the most important thing when you're an access coordinator is that you know that where you can reach out to find resources and to get answers. So I might not know how to answer your question off the top of my head, but I'm going to have some ideas of some starting places to go and kind of general idea of how to respond to this to see how to figure this out. And so that's also why it's really important that there is a point person that knows how to do that. I've worked with a museum that shall remain nameless. It's not present here today, but I asked the museum and it's a larger museum, who the point person is for access, who the accessibility coordinator is, or who staff would go to if they had a question about accessibility. And I got about 10 different answers, and internally they were scrambling to try to figure it out. They couldn't even figure it out. So I think that tells you that there isn't a lot of access work happening at that organization. They're not sure because they know many people are doing different things, but there's no one really tracking everything that's happening. It's also really helpful because you need to have a staff person that you can refer your volunteers or your other staff to if they have questions. So if you have a question about access, ask Christena, and maybe Christena, myself, I don't know everything that's going on, but I'm going to be able to reach out to other folks and figure it out and get an answer for you. So that is very, very important. And before you do any other work, you need to kind of figure out who that person is. And like I said, it's probably going to be you, and that's okay. But it'll be really helpful for your efforts if you have somebody who can help track all this. We mentioned this in a previous session, but a statement of welcome, that's just my word for it. But I think it's really helpful to include this for every event description that you have. So it says something like, guests with disabilities are welcome. Our organization is committed to welcoming everyone to our event. We are providing, if you're doing any accessible service, you would list it there for this event. To request another access service or to learn more, please contact email address or phone number with as much advance notice as you can. Having a phone number and an email address is ideal because different people need different ways to communicate. So it's helpful if you're being really clear about who people can contact. If you have to choose, having an email address is probably the most important, because that's going to be especially important for deaf guests or people who are hard of hearing to communicate with you. That's primarily what they're going to use to make their requests. But both is really great. And thinking about especially older adults love to have a phone number to be able to call, for instance. So that's really helpful to have both of those. And I do know organizations that are very reticent to give one or the other out for whatever reason, but for the purposes of accessibility, having choice and letting your guests choose how to communicate with you is already signaling that you are ready to be flexible and accommodating for them. And then you want to make sure that this email address and phone number is checked regularly probably by you, but by somebody who is at least a little knowledgeable about accessibility at your organization, because we don't want this to be checked by a part-time staffer who doesn't know much about the access efforts happening, because chances are they're not going to be answering correctly. They might really create some problems for you, and also would not be, I think, conveying the sense of welcome that we want people to get. I've seen different statements like this, and some of them read like straight from like a legal policy. I think it's really important that you are trying to set a tone of welcome, of setting a tone of, we want you to be here and we're going to try to do our best to make sure you're accommodated. I've also seen different statements of welcome that include a deadline for people to contact them by. So sometimes they might say 2 weeks before the event. That's, I think, a common one that I've seen. I personally don't think that it's worthwhile to put in a deadline because regardless, the law wants us to do our best to provide accommodations. So I think saying as soon as you can, as getting the point across that please do it as soon as you're able to do it. But maybe somebody just saw the description 2 days ago and they want to request an accommodation. You can do your best to provide it. You might not be able to, but you can try, and you should try. So I feel like advance notice just something to be careful of. And I think setting that welcoming tone is saying, please let us know as soon as you can, but we're not putting a time limit on it, because thinking about guests without disabilities, they can RSVP the day before and don't need to ask for anything and don't need to know anything, and they're coming. So we want to give an equitable experience to other people with disabilities. So that's my thought on this anyway. And then we also need to be prepared that if we have a statement of welcome, we need to know how to answer it. So what do we say when people ask for things that we don't know what they are? If you receive a request you're unfamiliar with, your default answer should be, let me check and get back to you. So you're acknowledging the person's request. You're not saying yes or no. You're not committing to something that maybe you can't pull off, but at the same time, you're not immediately shutting down the request. I have a friend, I don't think I've shared this story before, but I have a friend who worked at a museum on the West Coast, and this friend got a request for CART captioning. It was labeled as CART and they didn't have the word captioning in it. And CART is an abbreviation for communication, access, real-time translation, but they just put the acronym in there, the person making the request. My friend didn't know what CART was. So my friend did some quick Googling, which didn't, I don't think, adequately explain to them what CART was. And they thought it cost thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And in this case, it wouldn't have cost that much. But they thought it was super, super expensive and thought they had to buy specialized equipment. They were wrong. They told the person no. The person was very upset, turned into a big thing. When the default answer should have been, let me check and get back to you. Googling isn't necessarily the wrong thing to do, but I would say, you know, there's a lot of misinformation or incorrect information that can be found on the internet, as I think we know, especially this year. So I would talk to somebody knowledgeable about what this is so you can find out more about it. So you can do your own research, but also talk to somebody who knows more about accessibility. So reaching out to somebody at CCAC, there's the Kennedy Center Lead Conference, which is a great international conference to know about. And they are having a conference next year, so you should check that out. They have an awesome listserv where you can ask questions. There's also the Great Lakes ADA Center, which is actually based in Chicago, and they have free technical support, a hotline number you can call with legal questions related to the ADA. So those would be some of the places I would turn to get some answers for what this request is and if it seems possible or reasonable for you to pull off at your organization. So doing that research, and probably need to run it by your supervisor if you report to somebody else to see if it might be possible. You also want to make sure you're going to get back to the person as promptly as you can. So even if it takes some research, just saying, we're still finding out more about this, but we'll get back to you soon. Or even asking the person, I'm not familiar with this request. Could you share a little bit more information about what that is also helpful too. Because in this case, the person requesting CART could have explained a little bit more or could have suggested somebody to use who could do captioning or could give them more information. So it's okay to also go back and ask a few more questions, but definitely do your research to see if it's necessary and possible for you to do. And then the other question you get is, do we have to? Do we have to do what people are asking us to do? What if we receive a request that we can't provide? The short answer is you probably do. Chances are good that you actually can fulfill the request. Even if it's something you've never done before, you probably can pull it off. And in order for you to just say no, you would need to demonstrate an undue hardship or that it is a fundamental alteration to your program under the ADA. This is a very high threshold to meet, and most organizations, even small organizations like yours, will have a hard time demonstrating that case, depending upon what the request is, of course. But most of the time, the answer is you probably need to do it. Like that example of somebody requesting American Sign Language last minute, you know, they're asking the day of, or I've received requests like that before. I write back to the person, I'll do my best. I'll see what I can find out. I try to call a few different people, reach out to some different folks, put out some SOS type things to see if I can find somebody. Maybe I can, maybe I can't, but I've done my due diligence to try to find somebody. I haven't just summarily said, no, we can't do that. That's too late. So you need to try your best. And do remember that the ADA prohibits charging the guest with disabilities for your access service. So sometimes I've had different folks say, say like, my boss wants to know if we can ask the guest to pay for the sign language interpreter or that kind of thing. So no, the answer is no, you can't put that cost onto the guest. For describe your accessibility, provide detailed access information on your website and in other collateral material. I would suggest making even a tab or making a section that's devoted to accessibility. Sometimes I see these also included with like amenities, and accessibility is not an amenity. I mean, it may benefit and it will benefit your space, but it often is a legal requirement. And it makes it seem like it's like you're doing it for people's comfort, when in fact, some people may need the accommodations that you're providing or the accessibility you're providing. So I feel like accessibility or accessibility for guests with disabilities would be a helpful way to frame it rather than amenities. And if you do have some aspect of your space or your event that is not accessible, you need to acknowledge it. Some people, I think, are afraid to say it out loud or put it in writing as if that will make them more at risk for legal action. I would say, again, not a lawyer, but in my experience, what's best is to give the guests as much information as possible, and then the guests can decide whether or not it's for them. Because remembering disability is on a spectrum, right? So if, for instance, my friend is a wheelchair user, but they actually do have some mobility. So for instance, if there was one small step at the entrance, they would be able to push their wheelchair up themselves, or they, for whatever reason, would be able to get themselves up on that step. And they don't mind and it's no big deal, then they can do it. Whereas somebody else might say that won't be possible for me, I won't be able to come. So saying that up front is really, really helpful and avoids a lot of those very tense situations where somebody gets there and they're not able to access it, which is when emotions are high and it's hard for you in the moment too. So the example that I have here is our entrance currently has one small step up with a door width of 36 inches. I'm trying to give as much info as possible about this inaccessible spot of your physical space, and people can decide from there. Owning and acknowledging your kind of failures or the areas that you need to work on in terms of accessibility is good. That doesn't mean that for the next 20 years, you get to say that all the time and you've never made any effort to fundraise or anything. So that doesn't just give you a pass to not do anything, but it is helpful to be clear and upfront. We don't want to make assumptions about what guests can and can't do. And on this accessibility page of your website, you could add the statement of welcome. So making it clear how people can contact you, how people can reach you to request other things, because you're going to put as much as you can up there and people may still have other questions or need other accommodations. Sometimes I see the word ADA used on here, used for things like this. ADA is often misapplied. ADA is a legal term. It's not an identity. And when you say something's ADA compliant or not ADA compliant, I don't really think that tells people very much. So I would suggest using the word accessibility, not using the word ADA. I don't think it ever needs to come up in any of your writing for your website or your collateral material. And then finally, you should assume both an informational and welcoming tone. So we want to include as much information up front, but we also want to make it clear that we want people to be here. So we don't want to make it seem like this is burdensome and we're really like, ADA compliant. This is why we're doing this. You may come, sounding like a robot. We want people to feel the warmth and welcomeness feeling of our space. And oftentimes for our smaller spaces too, like we are kind of usually like smaller organizations, and we do have a very personal touch. So make sure that that comes across in these too, that it doesn't just feel very cold, because that will come across to people too. Training your staff and volunteers. It's really important to establish ongoing access-related staff training. You could also include accessibility into your general training. So as you're getting started, it's okay if you don't have a dedicated access training, but if you do have any types of training, can you work in even a few sentences or a few minutes to the training so that you're talking a bit about accessibility? So you're identifying the access coordinator to all of the staff and volunteers, so everyone knows where to go if they have questions, and that you're talking about people with disabilities coming into the space and what common questions they might have. And even if you don't have great answers, you could have sort of, this is what we say when people comment about this, so that you're really starting to infuse accessibility into what you're doing. Make sure that you have accessibility mentioned in your handbook if you have one, even if it's a few sentences, but that you are including this in everything that you're doing. There's a little bit about accessibility in there. You want to also make sure you're using the statement of welcome, I think, for internal meetings or events. So just starting like by, again, modeling these approaches so that your other colleagues are thinking more about accessibility in different ways. So if you have a large meeting or you have a board meeting, having the statement of welcome at the bottom is really going to convey to the board how serious you are about accessibility, and maybe they've never seen this before. And even for board members, maybe there's some board members with disabilities too, that haven't identified before. And then whenever we're discussing anything guest related, we're talking about the visitor experience, ask about people with disabilities. So even if you don't have an answer, you could just say, I feel like we've not talked about people with disabilities and this thing we're talking about. Do you have any ideas of any issues that might come up, or how might they access the space? And just start the conversation there. So it's okay, again, if you don't have all of the answers. I know you're wearing a lot of hats, but we need to start talking about this regularly in different ways. And this is going to get people thinking, and this is going to get probably more people excited about accessibility at your organization too. Remembering that accessibility is simply an extension of good customer service. So we're thinking about all the possible things a guest may need in order to access our space. So kind of changing and reframing your way of thinking about this as like, this is a huge topic that I don't understand very much about, to how can we think about what our guests might need and go from there. Finding internal allies. Try to find somebody that you can work with. I know you're from very tiny organizations, but is there somebody internally that is interested in accessibility or seems moderately supportive of the work that you're doing, or who's going to help you fill out that self-evaluation? See if you can schedule regular lunch meetings, like every other month you're going to get together to talk about access things. After each meeting, make a goal of one simple thing you can do to advance your access work. So maybe that's attending another professional development training. Maybe that's adding the statement of welcome to your website. Maybe that's one small thing, but when you're meeting, just make sure you're not just kind of maybe complaining or kind of just being like, yeah, we should do that. Yeah, we need to do that. What is one thing we can do? And maybe that one thing is reach out to a colleague at another organization because we're at a dead end, or something like that. So just making a plan to reach out to other folks if we need help. So speaking of reaching out, finding and identifying external allies. So from a comparable, see if you can find someone from a comparable organization or a cultural administrator with similar priorities. Or maybe I heard from a few of you from the survey who have partnering institutions. Is there somebody there that knows about accessibility or cares about accessibility? And in addition to the administrative professionals that you're going to be speaking with, see how you can get connected with audience members or other people with disabilities. Sometimes call these types of people user experts. So see if you can meet regularly with them, if that's doable. If not, do you have their okay to reach out and email them or give them a call if you have a question? So you can reach out to them. So you have other people to run things by. So it's not just you in a vacuum, not sure what to do. And then I do want to also remind you we want to thank user experts with money if possible, or with lunch or free tickets or something. So just remembering not to take advantage of free labor, of their expertise and of their experience. So want to also acknowledge them in the program or on the website too. And then you can also be connected and find colleagues and people with disabilities on CCAC's listserv. So there's a lot of different ways you can get connected, but you're going to need to find somebody else outside of your organization to talk to and to get some ideas and run things by. And the Disability Rights Credo is nothing about us without us. So this is a reminder that what we're doing, we need to make sure that we are including people with disabilities in the decisions and planning that we're making, so that we're doing this effectively and we're actually being inclusive. So taking the next step, we need to be thoughtful and intentional, but we also need to do something. So we don't want to be too caught up in being perfect, and instead just start something. So just try something. Accessibility does not need to be a big initiative or a pilot program or something that's going to take a lot of your headspace. You can start small. Maybe you hire an intern with a disability and that's your first step. That's something, but start small and then you can scale up as time goes by. So I really challenge you to identify 1 to 2 goals for improving accessibility in the next year. I heard from a few of you in the survey, you had like 5 or 6 different goals for the next year. I challenge you to actually whittle those goals down to 1 or 2 things that you can actually achieve in the next year. If you get those done really fast, great, then you can add more. But if it ends up taking longer or being more challenging than you expected, then you hopefully won't lose momentum to keep going forward. And I keep saying to reach out to people, but I do really want to encourage you, because cultural accessibility colleagues I've found to be really open and eager to share their resources and what they've learned with you, which is honestly very different than a lot of other contexts when I've talked to colleagues from quote unquote competing organizations, but maybe are a little proprietary with some things or not as helpful. Everybody who does this work genuinely wants to see more organizations do this work. So we want to share as much as we can with you. So take advantage of that. Please ask for help if you don't know where to go. It's really important. My favorite quote, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." So reaching out for help, thinking of 1 or 2 things you can do, it's a really great starting place. So I'm sharing now a QR code, and we'll send this out via email as well, but you are invited to complete another survey. But basically, this is going to be a way for you to hopefully get connected with a buddy organization, with somebody else who attended here today, to see if you can get connected, if your goals are going to be similar, that you can work together and hopefully hold each other accountable. And then I also will do my best to connect you with a peer at a different organization that maybe is a little further along in their access journey, to try to connect you with them as well. So I want to try to help you take this next step and help you get connected to other folks. So this is a way to do that. Please complete this by October 31st, and I will try my best to connect you with other folks. This is totally optional, but this is something I'm trying to hopefully help you move things forward. I know we're running short on time, but I did want to talk a bit about budgeting as well. Budgeting and funding came up a lot when it came to completing these surveys. So something to think about is thinking about scheduling access services like American Sign Language or captioning versus having them available by request. So something to start thinking about now is the by request. So when you put that statement of welcome up, it's possible somebody's going to actually request something. And even if you don't put the statement of welcome up, it's still possible. So you want to begin by budgeting accommodations for by request things now. And you might not use that money, but it's helpful to start thinking about, like, there could be somebody that is going to need this. How much is this going to cost? So reaching out to service providers to get accurate prices so that you can reflect that in the budget. And then you can aim for future budgets to start putting those scheduled services into, but you always should include by request a possibility in your budget going forward. I also encourage everyone to add an access line item to each exhibition or production that covers accessibility costs. So thinking about, you're applying for a grant, for instance, for a new production of the Nutcracker that you're doing. Are you putting in for audio description for this grant? You should put it in. So think about these different events or exhibitions or things that you're putting on or asking money for, and making sure that whatever you're doing is including accessibility there. So it's really infused across your entire budget. Also, make sure you're talking to your fundraising staff, or maybe you are the fundraising staff, but remembering to communicate the importance and the cost of accessibility so that that is on their radar to help get funders. And if you ever in a situation where they are rebuffing or saying like, I don't think we can have the money to do this, I don't think this is realistic, point to other comparable sized organizations that are able to pull this stuff off. Because large or small, there are organizations doing amazing work in accessibility, and you can point to them and hopefully apply a little pressure to say, if this tiny organization can do it, why can't we do it? And if you don't know or aren't aware of what they are, you can ask your external ally to hopefully connect you with somebody who can tell you. Then thinking about one-off expenses like assistive listening devices or upgrading your physical accessibility, we can incorporate those types of things into a capital campaign, or you could apply for a specific grant. There is the ComEd Powering the Arts grant. I'm guessing some of you already know about this. I'm actually a grant reviewer for it, and I know a few different organizations that have asked for physical accessibility upgrades for their space, or an accessible restroom or an accessible space. So that is one possibility. Also looking to your local service organizations like your Lions Club or Rotary Club. I used to be at the Evanston Arts Center, and we put in a small grant from the Rotary Club, I believe, in Evanston, and we were able to get money to pay for an accessible throwing wheel for ceramics. So thinking about some of those physical accessibility costs or those one-off expenses, trying to apply for a grant specifically for that. Right now, diversity is such a hot topic for fundraising. Remember that disability is a part of diversity. So trying to see how you could work that into the grants that you're doing. And also remembering that people of color are more likely to have a disability. So also working that into the narrative and trying to work that into your request is a good idea. There was, I think before COVID, there was like a grant opportunity that I believe was from the city for grants for physical upgrades. But if you're not based in Chicago, but in a different city, contact your city government to find out if there's physical upgrade grants for physical accessibility. And then another idea is Lifeline Theater in 2016 hosted their gala that was all about accessibility. It was really cool. CCAC received an award there, which is how I got to go. But they showcased their audio description and demonstrated what audio description was for everyone. They had American Sign Language interpreters and captioning, and they made it all about equity and access, and that was great for their member base and was a great thing to fundraise for, because they broke down the different costs of what it costs to do this, what it costs to do that when it comes to accessibility, and really had people step up to fund it. So trying to think about how we can make access maybe the focal point for a while to try to get some fundraising, and maybe even focusing your Giving Tuesday efforts around focusing for access upgrades. For instance, if you do have these one-off costs, like we have this very concrete cost of $3,000 for assistive listening devices that we need to raise or whatever, that can be a helpful approach too. So I will stop sharing now, and I'm ready for some of your questions if you have them. We have about 10 minutes left. And if not, I can share some of the submitted questions too. I'll share some submitted questions. I received a lot of questions in the survey about what do guests with disabilities need? How can we make sure we are being respectful? There were 5 different people that talked about respect and that they were worried that they weren't respecting their guests with disabilities. This is a great question. And I think the very fact that you're asking these questions is really important, and also shows that you are on the right track already. I would say that these questions should be questions you're asking yourself for every event that you're putting on. What do we need? What do guests with disabilities need? How can we consider them and make sure whatever we're offering is done with a tone of respect? I mean, I think the fact you're asking already shows that you're thinking about it and headed in the right direction. But I think I feel like you know at this point what I'm going to say, but there's some ways you can find out, which is reach out to your audience, make sure that you are developing relationships with all of your audience, of course. But if you know there specifically are people, like there are these 5 people that come for audio description all the time, make sure you are introducing yourself to them and make sure you're following up with them afterwards. How was your experience? What could we do better? Can I have your email address so that if I could ask you a couple of questions, or maybe even could I schedule an audio described performance around your schedule so you can come? Like, I'd love to develop this relationship with you. I think is going to help you be respectful and also make sure that you're getting buy-in and getting support from your guests too. Certainly doing a survey or something like a bigger effort like that would be really, really helpful. I don't know realistically if that's something you're going to do with your time, but I think getting involved with these different professional development sessions and staying connected with like disability Twitter or with different social media folks who are focusing on disability, those are some of the ways you can start to really, I think, embody accessibility. So I think you're on the right track there. It looks like we got a question that was submitted, which is, I brought up sensory-friendly programming to our artistic team, but I'm not sure we're understanding how to go about that. Can you point out some great examples? I'm not sure if this is specifically for, I'm going to go with, is this a theater or place that has performances? I'm going to assume that it is and answer it around that, but you can follow up with me afterwards for more questions. There are a lot of great organizations that are doing this really well. 2 larger ones that I would point to would be TDF, which is Theater Development Fund, which is based in New York. They call theirs autism-friendly performances. They are really a go-to for a lot of these, and they were at one time, and I don't know with COVID what's happening there, but they were offering grants and some training for sensory-friendly things too. So they did train like Lifeline Theater in the past and many other organizations across the US, but they're a great resource. And then the Kennedy Center also does really awesome programming. Steppenwolf, prior to COVID, was doing some really awesome work as well. So that's a local example of a relaxed performance. That's what they call it. And also Lifeline Theater was doing it as well. So those are some that come to mind offhand. And also Red Kite as part of Chicago Children's Theater. That's another one. So there's a lot of really great resources specifically about sensory-friendly programming. So I think those would be like my go-to for performance-based ones. Also the Harris Theater is another one. And I'd be happy to connect you to some of these folks after this too. But this would be a great question to also ask the listserv of, hey, anyone out there doing sensory-friendly programming? Can you tell me more about it and get connected with some people? I know that Aspire, which is a service organization that serves people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including autistic people, they have been doing a lot of training, for instance, with the Harris Theater, to help make sure that the staff and volunteers for that were prepared for how to best welcome guests that are on the autism spectrum. So there's a lot of different things to go to with that. I feel like that's a really good question and one that you can find a lot of resources for. And if you're thinking more about a museum or exhibition space, I can also steer you into that direction too. So let me know offline. If you have any other questions, keep popping them in the chat. We've got a couple more minutes. I'll put another question up. We did talk a little bit about this, but what do guests need to know in advance? That was another really good question. I think having that statement of welcome is really important because you are going to hopefully put that on every event that you have. And so people don't have to search through your website to try to find out more information if they have questions. Being really clear, even on that, maybe linking to your accessibility page on your website, that's going to have more information will be helpful. I think also just kind of walking, we would say in CCAC, walking the patron path. So kind of thinking about or rolling the patron path, but thinking about like if you were dropped off by PACE, which would be accessible transit in Chicago, that's what that's called. But if you're dropped off by PACE or, you know, you drove to the organization, like start outside and kind of walk through it and look around and think about, if I was in a wheelchair, what would this be like? If I was doing this, what would this be like? And if that's hard for you to do, sometimes then getting connected with guests who do have disabilities and asking them to actually, you're physically together going through the entire experience is going to show you a lot. I've done this before with different organizations and different people with disabilities, and, you know, like rolling up to the ticket counter, and then the staff member realizes, oh, wow, this ticket counter is like really high, and a wheelchair user can't see the person behind the counter. Or, you know, like you have some revelations that you might not realize otherwise. So I'd suggest kind of doing that walkthrough and just sharing all of that information. I think you don't want to make it incredibly overwhelming, but you do want to provide well-organized kind of route of like getting here, what that looks like for a person with a disability, like what it looks like when you arrive, kind of acknowledging where there might be issues up front so that you're hopefully avoiding that stress of somebody not being able to access something and being very upset in the moment, that kind of thing. So I think it's really helpful to do that, and then you'll learn a lot more about it. But even thinking about like older adults that you have in your life, because they probably have a disability, even if they don't identify. So like if my 95-year-old grandmother were here, what would I need to do? Kind of like, what would she need? Well, she would need a bench and the entrance. She would have a hard time, you know, getting through here, and kind of acknowledging that right away is also a really helpful thing to think about. So I think I'm going to stop the share there because we are essentially at time. Thank you so much again to the Donnelly Foundation for having me for these 3 sessions. And thank you all for participating. And I hope that we can stay connected and hopefully help you move forward in your accessibility journey.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was wonderful. And thanks to everyone for coming today.